1 year ago, Pixar had the biggest animated film of all time. Inside Out 2 opened to $154 million domestically and went on to make $1.69 billion worldwide. It was a complete vindication, proof that Pixar could still command a theater, still make audiences show up, still justify the name on a poster. 12 months later, Elio opened to $21 million. Worst debut in Pixar's 30-year history. Third place at the box office. Behind a live-action dragon movie and a zombie sequel nobody was particularly expecting to dominate. And here's what makes it genuinely strange. Elio is actually a good film. Critics gave it 84% on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences gave it 91%. CinemaScore gave it an A. The people who saw it largely loved it. They just didn't show up. So today I want to dig into how that happens. Because Elio isn't really a story about a bad movie bombing. It's a story about a good movie that got undermined at almost every turn. By a troubled production. By a studio that may have trained its own audience to stay home. And by a release strategy that put a $150 million original film in an extremely difficult position. Let's get into it. The film was originally conceived by Adrian Molina, one of the co-writers of Coco, a genuinely beloved Pixar film, so this was a credible starting point. The film was officially announced in September 2022 with Molina attached to direct. It follows 11-year-old Elio, who is mistaken for the intergalactic ambassador of Earth after being beamed up to an alien council called the Communiverse, and must navigate a crisis involving a warlord whose child he befriends. That's a solid premise. A misfit kid accidentally becomes humanity's representative to an entire galaxy of alien civilizations. There's real comic and emotional potential there, and it fits squarely in Pixar's wheelhouse of personal, character-driven storytelling wrapped in spectacular imagery. Molina conceived the story as being about childhood and social isolation, reportedly inspired in part by his own experiences growing up. That kind of autobiographical grounding is exactly what made Coco work. The early signs were encouraging. Then, the production ran into trouble. Molina later left the project due to creative differences and moved to work on Coco 2. In August 2024, it was announced that Domi Shia and Madeline Sharafian would replace him as lead directors. Domi Shia directed Turning Red, which is a genuinely strong film, so this wasn't a panic hire. But a director change this late in an animated production is always disruptive and expensive. Animated films aren't like live action shoots where you can theoretically swap directors between principal photography and editing. In animation, the director is shaping creative decisions that affect every single frame of a film that hasn't been fully rendered yet. Changing directors mid-production means revisiting decisions that were already in progress, rebuilding creative trust across an entire crew, and almost always extending the timeline. Pete Docter confirmed that the film's delay was due in part to the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike as well as the change in leadership. The film had originally been scheduled for March 2024. It landed in theaters June 2025, more than a year late. The reporting that emerged around the time of release, the director change may have been more than just a logistical disruption. Multiple insiders who spoke to The Hollywood Reporter claimed that characterizations of Elio as a queer-coded character were removed as the film moved through production, with an apparent push by Pixar executives to make Elio more masculine, including the removal of elements like his love of fashion and environmentalism. Some of those sources expressed disappointment, with one describing the changes as having destroyed this beautiful work, while another described the final version as much more generic compared to earlier cuts. It's worth noting that another Pixar source disputed some of these characterizations, so the full picture here isn't entirely clear. What seems less disputed is that the film went through significant creative changes during production. Whether those changes improved the film, compromised it, or simply redirected it, is something reasonable people disagree about. But creative instability of this kind rarely produces the best version of a film, and it often leaves marks that audiences register even if they can't quite articulate why. Before we get to the box office numbers, we need to talk about the context that frames all of them. Pixar's dominance has looked shakier since the pandemic, when several of its titles, including Soul and Luca, were sent directly to Disney Plus, while cinemas were recovering from prolonged closures. As a result, audiences were trained to expect those movies at home. This is arguably the most underrated factor in Elio's struggles and in Pixar's recent theatrical difficulties more broadly. Disney's decision to use Pixar films as Disney Plus content during the pandemic made short-term business sense, but it appears to have altered audience behavior in ways that have proven difficult to reverse. When families come to expect that a Pixar film will be available at home within a few weeks for no additional cost beyond their existing subscription, the incentive to pay for a theatrical ticket diminishes. As one industry expert framed it, you can't just use the brand Pixar anymore to just drive butts to seats. That erosion of theatrical habit is the backdrop against which every Pixar release since the pandemic has had to perform. Elio inherited all of it. Elio opened in third place with $21 million from 3,750 theaters, the worst start in Pixar's modern history. It added just $14 million overseas for a global opening total of $35 million. The film cost $150 million to produce, not including marketing spend. Some reports put total exposure closer to $250 million when marketing is factored in, though that figure varies depending on the source. To understand how significant that is by Pixar's own standards, the prior low water mark was 2023's Elemental, which had itself been considered a disappointing debut at $29.6 million domestically and $44.5 million globally. Elio opened below that. Notably below it. David A., Gross of the Franchisor movie consulting firm, put it plainly, these would be solid numbers for another original animation film. But this is Pixar. And by Pixar's remarkable standard, the opening is well below average. The film finished its theatrical run at around $154 million worldwide. A number that might sound reasonable in isolation, but represents a significant shortfall when measured against total spend. Whether it ultimately constitutes a loss depends on factors like international pre-sales and streaming revenue that aren't fully public, but few analysts are describing the result as a success. So a well-reviewed film from a respected studio opened to the worst numbers in the studio's history. A few factors help explain that. Elio opened the same weekend as Universal's How to Train Your Dragon live-action remake and Sony's 28 years later. The How to Train Your Dragon situation is especially relevant. That film had opened the previous weekend to $83 million and retained the top spot with $37 million in its second weekend, meaning families who wanted an animated adventure had largely already made their choice. As both films were catered toward families and children, Elio was overshadowed before it even opened. Fandango's director of movie analytics noted, "There's more of a barrier of entry for original films, but Elio is a case of bad timing." Competition from family audiences was difficult to overcome. It makes you wonder how Elio would have performed in the spring, or even a week or two later. Release date decisions at this budget level carry enormous consequences, and landing directly behind a beloved franchise's live-action remake is a very hard position to recover from. Multiple analysts and observers noted that the film's marketing campaign didn't seem to generate the kind of broad awareness a $150 million film typically needs. The release date had moved around multiple times over more than a year, and whatever momentum had built around the original announcement likely dissipated during the extended production period. By the time Elio actually reached theaters, casual audiences had had limited consistent exposure to it. This point is bigger than Elio specifically, but it's important context. I don't think it's a Pixar issue. I don't think it's an animation issue. I think it's an entertainment issue, one industry expert observed. Hollywood is very reluctant to greenlight anything that's brand new. It's just the risk associated with it. Elio opened the same weekend as a live-action remake and a long-running franchise sequel. It was the only genuinely original property in the top 5. In the current theatrical landscape, that's a meaningful disadvantage regardless of quality. This is the most speculative of the failure factors, but it's worth raising because multiple industry voices have flagged it. One animator and professor suggested Pixar had settled into this stage visually and design-wise where they are cosplaying themselves, arguing the studio had become constrained by its own established aesthetic in ways that were limiting rather than defining. Whether that's a fair characterization of Elio specifically is debatable. The film's alien designs are genuinely inventive, but the broader concern about the studio's creative direction is one that predates this film and doesn't seem to be going away. Here's where I want to be straightforward, because the audience response suggests the film is genuinely worth seeing, and that matters for understanding what kind of failure this actually is. The visual ambition is real. The production team developed a specific process called the College Project to define the look of the Communiverse, and Pixar's new Luna lighting toolset was used to establish lighting and aesthetics simultaneously. The alien character designs, particularly Elio's companion Glorden, whose look was reportedly influenced by larval insects and microscopic creatures, are inventive in a way that feels more distinctive than some of Pixar's recent work. The emotional core works too. The story of a kid who feels like he doesn't belong anywhere, who accidentally ends up representing an entire planet, has real resonance. The film earned its a CinemaScore because the people who saw it responded to something genuine in it. What it arguably doesn't fully deliver is the kind of thematic weight that made Coco or Inside Out genuinely exceptional. Films where the visual spectacle and the emotional argument were completely inseparable. Whether that's a result of the director change, the reported creative alterations during production, or simply the constraints of a compressed timeline, the finished film feels like something that's good, but perhaps not quite what it was conceived to be. That's an impression, not a certainty, but it's one the production history lends some credibility to. That's the most frustrating kind of failure to write about. Not a disaster. Not a clear misfire. A film that seems to be carrying the outline of a more specific version of itself and can't entirely escape that shadow. Elio isn't Pixar's worst film. It may not even be a flawed one by most reasonable standards, but it's arguably the clearest symptom yet of a studio that has been working against itself, conditioning audiences to wait for streaming, navigating creative instability mid-production, and releasing original films into difficult windows without sufficient marketing support. As one industry expert put it, Pixar is going to have to reconcile with the fact that they won't just make money because it says Pixar on it. They're going to have to reinvent themselves. The studio's upcoming slate says a lot about how Disney read the Elio result. Toy Story 5, Incredibles 3, Coco 2. Every announced project is a sequel to an established property. Whether that represents a smart strategic pivot or a retreat from the kind of original storytelling that made Pixar great in the first place is a question worth sitting with. The name on the poster used to be enough. It may not be anymore. And figuring out what replaces it is probably the most important creative challenge Pixar has faced in a long time. What do you think? Did you see Elio? Did it deserve better? And do you think Pixar can find its way back to the kind of original storytelling that built its reputation, or has that window genuinely closed? Let me know in the comments.